we're going to keep that up for at least another week. So you can check out some of the films I'll be talking about. I'm going to show you a couple films as well. Please touch base if you're not sure how to get through to the films. As I said, they'll be up for another week. And these are really US premieres. In fact, there's just one film by Hahnemann that has been available on DVD also for many years, which is this DVD called Counter Images, GDR Underground Films, which was released by the DEFA Film Library in 2008. And it includes a more lyrical piece by Hahnemann called September, September. So you can check that out through the DEFA Library website. So Hahnemann was born in 1946 and died all too soon in 2006 at the age of 59. He made 31 films between 1982 and 1990. And he actually was trained as an architect, but had worked as a model. His turn to film was really serious for him. He made elaborate film treatments for all of his works, even short ones like Schleich Boy, which you will have seen or will see in the film screening. In his films, he weaves together personal history with an interest in Germany's cultural heroes and iconic sites, with his own identity as a gay man, as well as participation in this really rarefied experimental writing scene. So I think what really fascinates me about this particular person is not only how collaborative and community oriented he is, which is something I'll talk about, but also that he was just as dedicated to writing as he was to filmmaking. So there's a lot of material. Here's a lovely book of some of his works that was published in the early 90s. For example, writing works. It also includes some of the film studies. So his kind of screenplays and things like this, indicating, of course, the kind of crossover that happens between these two. And as some of you will have seen in the Hölderlin film, including in the streaming, we see this narrative of the Romantic poet Hölderlin told with leading poets and visual artists, set to the backdrop of the Baroque Soislitz Castle, as well as in the well-known ceramic studio of the artist Wilfrieda Maas. And those are names that will mean something to those who study East German art, and those who do not, you can watch this film and know that you're seeing this really interesting combination. So as mentioned, right, this material is coming out of my book, this right here. I'll read a little bit from it because I have some descriptions that, that work well. And I'll just take a second to frame this research on Hahnemann within the context of my book, Parallel Public. The main thrust of the book is really to dismantle conventional ideas of citizen oppression. And yes, that happened, but what else happened, right? How did artists navigate social and political constraint through creative activity? So examining how experimental artists infiltrated the communist Germany's cultural garrisons reveals that the strategies they used were not acts of subterfuge, but discernible ploys. The novel and conspicuous use of the body in performance art or photography, as you see here in Gundula Schulze-Aldawi's photograph of a man who is taking a break from working at a rubber factory. You can see that he has been, has wiped away all the soot everywhere except for his nose, which gives us a nice suggestion of what kind of contamination is happening within his body. The Super 8 film cameras that artists employed to record themselves. So here is a nice image from a film called the Goethe film, which was is not included in the screening, but has a lot of similar kind of themes of cultural history that we see in the Hölderlin project. The independent typewritten pages, photographs, and silk screens that appear in independent publications, such as this really fascinating exhibit by Anschlag, which was a publication out of Leipzig that had a nice kind of symbiotic relationship with Eigenart. It's just a gallery that actually still exists today. And then, of course, the gathering places that turned enclaves into spectacles. Here I have a poster from an event that the Erfurter Künstlerinnengruppe Exter XX put on at a major kind of feminist summit that took place in a church in '88. And for those of you who had the chance to see Elske Rosenfeld's talk last month, you would have gotten a little introduction to Gabriele Stutzer through that experience. So regarding the spectacle, and now I'll just turn my focus completely toward to Hahnemann, but I do have images from other parts of my book if you want to look at those. Here you see a really emblematic photograph, illustrative photograph, I should say, of Hahnemann arranging his film projectors at an event. And I like this image, even though, as I'll say, it doesn't necessarily square with what we see in Hahnemann's films in particular. It does nevertheless give you a nice sense of how spontaneous film screenings were in East Germany. So the kind of quality of, working with material that might break, for example. There's even texts written that say, hey, your film's probably going to break when you're projecting it. No big deal. That just means next time you show it, it'll be a little bit different, right? Music and voiceovers would be attached later, or rather spontaneously in the screening space. So what you saw in the screening, or what you will see, is music or texts that were selected for the DVD compilation that he produced with Matthias Fischer in 2006. And that would have been the case for all these films. I think it's really interesting if you have the chance to ever go to the Brotfabrik in Berlin and look at more experimental films. Every single one is a DVD recording that just captures this one kind of iteration of sound, but not how it would have been experienced every single time, which is such a cool part about experimental film, I think. And again, a good way of understanding the way a film screening might look is this image. Hahnemann was part of a very large scene of experimental film that's really well documented in Klaus Loeser's book, Strategien der Verweigerung, and also in Seth House's Moving Images on the Margins. And both of these books, especially Seth's, really addresses this Schmalfilmszene. So it's a little bit different than the underground experimental film scene, because these were folks that were like keen on making really professional looking films, and actually created people such as Andreas Dresen, who's like a really famous filmmaker today in Germany, and even Anna-Kathrin Hendel had some connection with this as well. And I think it's really interesting that Hahnemann, he's part of this experimental scene, but he's very, very professional in his production. And yet he wasn't a part of this group of people that were also doing really professional productions. He clearly wanted to be a part of these, of this group of artists who were, crossing media and the way that he was interested in, or the way that a film screening can bring lots of communities together, whether that be in the the event of the film itself, or in the creation of the film through bringing communities together. So again, this setup is maybe a little unusual for Hahnemann, whose films are really precise and scripted. As you can see, you saw the film treatment, and then here's a storyboard for the Holderlin project. And this way, it's even a little bit tricky to categorize, for me anyway, to categorize Hahnemann as part of this scene, because he really seems to have been on his own path. Even his friends, including Cornelia Schleimer, who made films because she had kind of an exhibition prohibition, so she wasn't really able to show her paintings, and was encouraged by Hahnemann to pick up the camera. Even she told me that he clearly wanted to make professional films and had kind of a different angle of approach in doing that. And this is really a kind of a hallmark, but also kind of a downfall, because how can a person achieve what they want out of Super 8 film, which is soundless, right? Which doesn't attach sound, or at least not the stock they had in East Germany, and is super cantankerous. So it's like not very precise. It's kind of, it can break really easily. It's really small. So it's like hard to work with, to manipulate, to edit. And this is where I think the storyboards are particularly fascinating to consult, because you see, of course, in the photograph, right, like how nice the image looks, right? So you can almost, look at the film and then look at the storyboard, or the screen treatments, and kind of imagine what Hahnemann himself was visualizing when he was making his films. So a lot of his films show a person working to create, this kind of signature. So somebody that, when you look at his works, Hahnemann's works, you really see a kind of style. It can be campy, or there's a lot of attention to a body, typically male and nude, or dressed in some kind of attractive costume, but also often just the body in some kind of masterful motion. So from acrobats doing tricks to young people, even children dancing. And I'm going to show you a 6-minute film called I Will Never Forget Paradise. It's not included in the screening. And I want to note that this film opens with a brief excerpt from Stefan Herrmann's book, Abendlicht, Evening Light, which is an autobiographical text and considered a kind of Bildungsroman that reflects the author's life experiences from his childhood in the Third Reich to his time being a committed communist writer. And I'm going to put a translation in the chat because for those of you who don't speak German, it'll be distracting. So here is that film. Actually, I had it all loaded up here. So let's see. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Umgeben von Armut und Verfall und dem Einbruch einer widerwärtigen Technik, stand ich lange neben den Märchenerzählern an den Straßenenden. Ihre Sprache verstand ich nicht. Nur in den Augen ihrer zerlumpten Zuhörer lebten die Bilder und Gestalten Menschen. Umgeben von Armut und Verfall und dem Einbruch einer widerwärtigen Technik stand ich lange neben Märchenerzählern an den Straßenenden. Ihre Sprache Ich empfand eine süße, einschläfernde Langeweile. Mehr war da nicht. Es war das Leben. Es machte müde und glücklich.
Right. So in that movie, you really see this kind of, it's an early movie, 82, this kind of fascination with, as I said, the mastery of the human body. And it's also really interesting to kind of, as an entry point to thinking about community or meeting new people, and using film as kind of a chance to do so, which came to be a real core point of the films, including Hard Romance, which I included in the screening. And those of you who have watched it will note that there's this really campy quality to this film, right? There's kind of like a lot of exaggerated ideas of masculinity, like leather boys, things like this. And it's fun though. I think there's a sincerity to that that's also really trying to embrace a group of people that probably didn't have a whole lot of visibility in East Germany at this time. And even this film actually takes its location as a village called Apolda, where Gino Hahnemann had grown up outside of Vienna, where he grew up. And he has this kind of notion like, oh, these people don't exist in this place. And clearly he's recording their existence. And not only that, but also them being in this very conspicuous motorcycle gang that he makes a story about, but nevertheless pretty interesting as a record of those populations. Hahnemann's films really reveal this person's extraordinary sociability. He's been described to be by many people as not only encouraging and curious, but extremely kind and welcoming. And in fact, that was a little bit of a trick when the wall came down. There's those kinds of necessities of these groups, or kind of having gathering places for malaligned or kind of smaller groups of communities. Those necessities just didn't exist in the same way once East Germany was opened to the West. And that's one of the reasons that it's been explained to me that he moves away from filmmaking in that moment. So his films bring together groups of people, writers, visual artists, gay men, but also gay youth and young people of color, which is a real rarity in the GDR, to be sure. I'm going to give you just a little bit of a description of this movie from the book. And as I said, it's available to you on the Eventbrite as well. Okay. Hard Romance visualizes a real-life motorcycle gang of gay men. They ride together and convene in a field where they chase and torment a young mustachioed man on foot. He returns home, nurses his wounds, and later administers care to his boyfriend, who has been struck by a delivery truck while riding with the bikers. Recovered, the two men rejoin their group of biker friends in a public park. His presence now welcome, the man with the mustache clambers over the structure around which the motorcycle gang gathers. A quotation, so here's a translation of that for those of you who watched the film. A quotation which Hahnemann attributes to the Russian author and translator Boris Pasternak concludes the film. The extent to which we are all human rests in the people whom we have loved or the possibility we have had to love, all of us. Liner notes, as I said already, suggest that Hahnemann filmed Hard Romance in the village of Apolda, located just outside of Vienna, where he spent his childhood. It documents the location where his sexuality may have once proved hazardous. As an adult, he returns and documents the gay men who, as his liner notes taunt, quote, do not exist in Apolda. It bears mentioning here that Hahnemann was an orphan adopted into a family of intellectuals who gave him the name Karl-Heinz Tansina. His self-ascribed surname, Hahnemann, embraces the German identity he had been raised with and cherished, while the first name Gino reflects the exotified projections he faced and capitalized on as a darker-skinned European man, including in his part-time work as a fashion model in the GDR. So one thing that's really fascinating too is that although Hahnemann, I have not seen evidence that he was, a strong activist. He nevertheless was a part of groups that were gathering in the church, in particular, this kind of grassroots movement that many of you will know about, that was advocating for the visibility of homosexuality and the rights for gay men, in particular men. And his films would be included often in film screenings that were kind of these social gatherings, again, that always or pretty much always took place in churches. They might be described as surreal, political, and erotic, or a night of fantasy. This poster, which is between fantasy and reality, was organized by the Homosexual Love Working Group. And I'll read to you the text it says above, the translation I have, which introduces his films. Whoever comes here for entertainment cinema and who wishes to be amused for an hour and a half will be disappointed. Gino's works are not really films, but more collages of painterly and dramatic elements that document and reconstruct real and fictional worlds. The audience members must thus trust the unusual contents and messages of these short films. So up on the screen, I also have an image from The Death of Kasper Hauser, which was also included in the screening. And this was actually one of the films that Matthias Fischer suggested I include in the screening, so that's great. And this work is really a reinterpretation of a famous German myth that some of you will be aware of, about a boy who was raised without language and in complete isolation. And this is clearly a work that also reveals a gay community that Hahnemann was a part of. One of the things that really interests me is the way that Hahnemann describes his homosexuality, or rather its role in his creative practice. When questioned about the apparent centrality of homosexuality in the poetry he wrote at the same time he was making his films, he explained that, quote, the gay aspect of my work is simply a theme. I'm describing a scene. I do not see myself as a gay author or that I only write for a queer audience. There is my existence as a writer, and there is my gay identity. One will influence the other, even though there are a lot of connections. Regardless, drawing attention to them is not my ambition. So it's tempting, but really limiting to read Hahnemann's work simply through a lens of identity politics. And I really deliberately included these two very playful films that embrace that, his homosexuality, just to give you that kind of friction here, right? That it's really tempting to look at them as something that's about homosexuality. And that's definitely a part of who he was and a part of a lot of his films. But sometimes it's not, again, it wasn't meant to be a central theme. And I think that that's just really interesting in general, thinking about the time, thinking about what's happening in other parts of the world and how people are describing their work. It also may be useful just for a moment to think about how Hahnemann reflected on the context of working in the GDR, which of course comes with its own huge amount of baggage and ideas of what artists were up to, especially those working independently. It's important that his works do not reflect any kind of frustration with his context, that they are not allegories for state oppression, which is an all too common expectation of independent artists in the Eastern Bloc, and one which I confront continuously in my book and other publications. Here is what Hahnemann had to say about his context. I did not feel physically, but culturally constrained in the GDR. Also with regard to film, I finally said to myself, just make your own cinema. And in here, there's this, when he says culturally I've always interpreted this as, you know, the real difficulty of traversing, entering the DEFA film studio, so the official film world, and just saying, okay, like, this is what I want to do. I really want to think about German culture. I want to think about my identity, and I want to do it on film. I want to do it in writing too, but the best way I can do it is just to do it myself. So he created what he calls Gino Kino, and I received these DVDs some years ago from Matthias, which was very generous, which includes, you know, a number of these works of his Gino Kino. And he picked up this mode, right, because it was a chosen method of self-expression, and also one that was really reinforced within his group of friends. So let me turn back then to films that engage with Germany's cultural legacy with some attention paid to the presence, but neither conspicuous nor obscured, of the filmmaker's homosexuality. So again, I'll read from the book and hear about Schleich Boy first. Hahnemann would make 2 works at one of the GDR's prized locations from the country's incongruous, though nevertheless venerated aristocratic past. Both Schleich Boy and the Hölderlin project were filmed at the Schleich Palace, located about 25 miles northwest of Dresden. The 4-minute Schleich Boy features a frolic through the palace grounds, all structured around the waking dream of a long-haired and flamboyant man. He dances, scampers, and climbs around the gardens. His joyful, if somewhat unskilled, pirouettes lead him to the palace's grand outdoor staircase and patio, where he joins hands with 3 other dancers, including the painter Cornelius Schleimer. 3 children dance in a circle, a fountain comes alive, as the adult friends waltz in merry affectation of the palace's former amusements. The second film for which Hahnemann would use the Schleich Palace as a backdrop is his Hölderlin project, a 19-minute work with an official title that is as long-winding and confusing as its contents. Ein Zeichen sind wir deutungslos und haben die Sprache in der Fremde verloren. We are a sign, meaningless, and we have forgotten our language in exile. Friedrich Hölderlin's biography is secondary in this film, with the 19th century German lyric poet more a loaded reference than a source of content. This is a scene film, S-C-E-N-E, that is to say, a film about being seen. Some of the experimental art and literature circle's most prominent figures lead the cast. In addition to Schleimer, who appears in the film as Diotima, the poet spy Sascha Anderson plays the lead role of Hölderlin. The film's main settings, the Schleich Castle grounds along the Elbe River and Wilfrieda Maaß's ceramic studio, likewise draw connections across time and culture. The former, a key site for the Dresden Romantics, is reincarnated in the latter, a locus point for East Berlin writers and artists in the 1980s. A loose drama, We Are a Sign, begins with Hölderlin floating lit red candles in the Elbe. Candles recur throughout, a rather pat symbol of the artist showing his followers the light. Hahnemann's film is really earnest, nevertheless, secure and unself-conscious in its yearning to communicate a feeling of admiration for Hölderlin. His film bears the poet's message. By its conclusion, his candles return. Like Hahnemann and his circle of artist friends, Hölderlin was underappreciated by the wider public in his time. East Germany's own official and somewhat idiosyncratic disinclination for romanticism had also turned the poet into a fairly obscure entity, perhaps thus contributing to his allure. We Are a Sign's loose and esoteric drama reflects the rarefied aesthetic that defined the GDR's experimental cultural scene, and in particular its literature. The film presents a unique iconography of recurring images and actions set in an elaborate backdrop. Catching, let alone making sense of the film's many signs, to think of its title, demands an attentive and generous viewer. This is Hahnemann's poetry, similarly cryptic, put to film. And there is this really intentional melodrama, exaggeration, I've said camp a couple times, an extreme excess of feeling with nothing spared and all being revealed. And this is really indicative, or characteristic, I should say, of all the artists that I have researched that are working in this 1980s scene. And again, it might be tempting, and in some cases it's true, to kind of interpret that as, okay, this excess of feeling is a way of really exceeding this really confining cultural and political condition of East Germany. But in another way of thinking about it is that these are incredibly proactive, I don't want to pretend always collaborative, but certainly aware of each other's processes and often collaborating. A scene of friends who really kept each other accountable for the kind of work they were making. And that seemed to have been most profoundly expressed through kind of extreme drama or extreme uses of the body, really elaborate costuming, things like that. All is really revealed in this scene, and Hahnemann's films are pretty exemplary of that. So I come now to nearing the end of this talk, when I want to talk about how it is that I could even begin to parse these really complex films, and the great benefit not only of many people really having loved this person and really wanting to talk about him, but also that he really archived himself. So he has this really vast personal archive that is was intended for a public audience and is incredibly well detailed, right? Often includes, notes about himself, things like this, very well organized. This archive, I have, just a couple of the images you've already seen, but also just a screen grab of my one page of many, many pages of notes that I've taken. So just the file names on this archive, which exists in the Akademie der Künste, which includes only the film work, right? So only the visual work, all the films, the storyboards, notes on research, and then this 5-volume autobiography. And one of the things that really drew me to Hahnemann was the clarity of the artist's archive. So, right, he clearly had a vision for himself, like this interest in the human capacity of the human body, the beauty of the human body, German cultural legacy, grappling with that as this orphan, right, who doesn't know his own past, but really loves and indulges in German literature in particular. And of course, many artists in the GDR actually created very vast and richly organized archives. Like, that's one of the cool things about doing this research, actually, is that there's a lot there. And I try in my book to really expose that research so that others can kind of know where to head if they're interested in these topics. But most people don't have them just public in an archive, right? Most of them are in their own homes, so you have to kind of work around those limitations. But this one I just kind of spent, like 6 months in. And my book, again, really exposes that work to try to initiate and spur further engagements. And I wanted to close by allowing Hahnemann then to have the last word, because his words are so profoundly present. And this is from volume 1 of this autobiography called Die Schleifspur des Geschwindigkeitsmessers im Fluchtrausch, which I have translated as the speedometer's stress marks in a flight of inebriation. If anybody has a better translation, please send it my way, because it is very, very cryptic. Anyway, and the thing that I want to mention is that Hahnemann kept this huge journal he wrote in the first volume to provide his partner, Matthias Fischer, the zigzags of my thoughts when he was out of town, which is interesting. And again, just to close with something that he said right at the beginning of the autobiography that kind of organizes the thoughts of this volume, of this 5-volume book. He writes, after all, anything that happens today can, will, and could change tomorrow or in a few years. Seen in this way, I am writing down the time between tomorrow and the years to come. What is said today may no longer be true tomorrow because it never came to pass. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sara, for this wonderful talk, enthusiastic and full of interesting thoughts, and probably also occasions for questions or comments. So if anybody has questions or comments for Sara, please go ahead. You can either put your reaction in the chat, or you can raise your hand. Kathy, I see a hand from you. Please go ahead. I hope you're unmuted. If not, I can.
No, that was a mistake. Sorry. I meant to congratulate Sara for this wonderful talk.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Looks like Juan Pablo.
Oh, thank you very much. That was a great talk. Thank you. I just have like three very quick and simple questions. The first one is if did he make documentaries?
Mm-hmm.
The second is if he was ever in contact with filmmakers from West Germany. And the other is if you can say something about the audio samplings. I was fascinated by the soundtrack of the films in which you have this sampling of, you know, from Strauss and Bach to Pink Floyd. So if you can say a little bit about that, I found that really interesting.
Right. So I feel almost like, oh, Matthias should answer these questions, but I'm not gonna make you do that. But please chime in. Documentaries, the closest that I've seen to a documentary was a series of video installations that he made for a theater project called Männerbiografien, which is, you know, others in this room will know about this already, which is this text written by Jürgen Lemke about gay experience in the GDR that was put to the stage in 1989. And Hahnemann created a set design for this. And that included it's not really documentary, but it's like he has these videos of places where gay men would meet each other in Berlin, right? So parks, things like this, or kind of a bus that seems to have been, I mean, not explained, but seems to have been some sort of meeting point as well. So that's as far as that would go in terms of documentary. Filmmakers from West Germany tended to not be very interested in East Germany. There's, in my book, I talk about a moment in the very last years of the GDR when this really major experimental film series or a festival called Interfilm that was taking place in Kreuzberg for many years finally included East German filmmakers. And those people were included because they had been friends with people who had moved west. So Cornelius Schleimer mediated some of this contact. But you know, frustratingly, there wasn't much exchange happening between East and West Germany, although East Germans really consistently wanted to be taken seriously by West Germans, but it didn't. And they actually, perhaps to a fault, didn't really look to further Eastern Bloc countries for kind of collaborations. But no, they were definitely not really engaging in the kind of level you're suggesting. And the audio samplings, it's really clear in that 5-volume autobiography or, you know, journal that that Hahnemann had a great interest in music and in like kind of a romantic or very exciting, you know, sort of emotional music. And then also was a person of his time, so would have listened to Pink Floyd. And Matthias, maybe you can add to some of the ways that you all decided to include which music to include when you made the DVD in 2006.
Yes, you can hear me? I don't know. My microphone's on.
Yep.
Yes. It's a very interesting question because, like you saw, when the movie was screening was absolutely amazing because there was always a live performance. So the idea of the screening the film was the event. Means there was a kind of exhibition, and Gino came with this stuff, but there was also a band, or there was also a man. So he make lyrics, or he bring the text actually with himself. So the screening was absolute stunning. So there was really always a live production. You see the picture, but also you had the band, was amazing musicians, and was like in the 20s. They see the movie and making the music live on the set, but also he had a tape machine, and then he just played the tape machine also. In the post-production, we find all these tapes together. And so he was even able then to make his own decision just for this DVD stuff. So this what you see on DVD have actually from the sound not so much to do with the live screaming. And this was always just amazing, I can say. From my own remembers, this was one part of a very important moment to have the experience to visualize picture with live sounds. That was amazing.
Thank you for filling in those details.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Anyone
Is
else?
it Kiwan? I'm sorry, I'm not sure how to pronounce your name.
Okay. Hi, I'm Kayvon.
Kiwan.
So yeah, I was also a little bit interested in the line between allegory and documentary in the films. Says himself he's not allegorizing, but he seems to be very interested in public spaces. In the first film you showed, you can kind of see the TV tower in the background. Would you say he is attempting to queer these public sites in a way, or is he really just doing his own thing in public settings?
Yeah, that's a great observation. And I wish that I could just have you see all these films, right? Because you would see this consistent interest in, absolutely queering places that would typically not include, a reference to homosexuality. And for example, he has well, in the screening, you can watch Soisitzbure, where he has this man like dancing around this Baroque castle. And in other films, this one called Roman Baths, he kind of takes the idea of a bath, which exists within a castle grounds, and makes this suggestion that it was created for, and it's just suggested, but for homosexual encounters. In that film, he has lots of close-ups of sculptures that really reveal the male anatomy, and he's making these these references to the fascination with the naked male body that exists in these really considered conservative spaces. And then he moves into having actual naked male bodies kind of running through this space, coming out of the water, and things like that. And he's doing a very not atypical way of identifying fascination, homosexual fascinations that are obscured by tradition or conservative description, and suggesting that these exist anyway. In The Death of Kasper Hauser, he takes this movie, or sorry, this story, and makes this suggestion that this orphan child is maybe what would happen if he actually was raised by nothing and then became this kind of feral homosexual biker man who has all these people he can meet with in this kind of random, almost trash heap outside of town. And I guess the allegory then, or sort of the autobiographical part, is really clear in those particular movies. But when I was talking about allegory earlier, I was kind of thinking about the tendency for people to think of East German arts as reflecting frustration with a specific East German context. And I think what he's really doing is asserting, right, the queerness of life in general that wouldn't have to have been made in East Germany, right? It's like a very, it's something that could have been made in other contexts as well, making the same visual argument. Does that answer your question?
Totally. I really like what you said. They exist anyways. Yeah, so I'll continue to watch those films. Thank you.
Sure, great. So glad.
Just a little detail to these questions, because it just came in my mind about the documentary, because actually almost any movie is a documentary, because it's one thing, it's a fact, all these actors are not actors in usual. So They're just friends, and all the people you see, he just come by. Sometimes they just cross the street and he picked them up and then he play in the movie. So the idea is to show not acting as a big artist, is show more acting as a normal person. And anyone you see, it's a little bit, I think, a Pasolini idea, you know, so there's always real life, and this is what you want to show up, and the people don't have to change themselves, they're just being real. And then finally in post-production he cut it all together and making, you know, the outline and all these facts, what is very important to make the movie. But finally this is so nice to have this coming together and playing the movie. This was always a big happening. And also one fact is interesting, in the 80s, late 80s in East Germany, all these castles you see was free, open space. So it was just amazing for any filmmaker, because most time it was a ruin, you know, it was not really happen. Most time was a kindergarten or whatever inside, and you just can go in the garden and nobody cares. So for him was the paradise to find all this nice environment, because it was for free. So this was a good thing for Gino, because his mind is Baroque, and we had a lot of castles in East Germany. He was open for making that happen, and it was no problem. It was easy to do. It was a nice fact, I think.
Thank you. I wanted to quickly remark on this translation of that line, the Schleifspuren, and so the term Fluchtrausch, I think the proper translation would be something like the inebriation of flight, rather than the flight of inebriation. And of course, the word Flucht is not an innocent word in East Germany, right? Because it's the word that is used for fleeing the German Democratic Republic. So this is quite an ironic and funny reference in that way, right? It's the tire marks that you make, or that rather that are picked up by the speedometer as you engage in a flight that is so fast that you become inebriated, something like that.
Oh, okay.
But I wanted to also comment on something else that I thought was fascinating in your talk, and that is your reference to earnestness. I mean, this line actually, in being quite funny and ironic, if I read it correctly, is actually not earnest in the sort of cliched sense in which, you know, we all sort of think of East German culture in general, but particularly East German culture, as super earnest and absolutely adverse to humor, which of course in an American context particularly often can make it feel quite alienated and difficult to grasp in its earnestness, but it actually maybe underplays the humorous aspects of the work. And I was wondering if you could comment on that, if humor, irony, and other forms of sort of self-reference play a role in these films. And then a second point, I wanted to come back also to the suggestion to the reference to the TV tower and the way in which in the clip you showed the human tower rivals the TV tower. That was a very telling element, and actually in some ways was a sort of an allegory. Or I wonder if you would read it as an allegory, whereby it was sort of a commentary on a critical commentary on these notions of progress that you could associate with the TV tower, and that of course absolutely unified, you know, East Germany with West Germany. You know, the two are always thought to be so far apart, but in actual fact, you know, their discourse of progress, you know, technological progress specifically, in many ways united them. And there was a technology critical remark in the text, in the caption that you put into the chat, right, where there's talk about, you know, the damaging intrusion of technology. So I'm wondering, is this sort of a version of progress and technology overall a kind of a part of the program, and to what extent can that be read politically? Would be another question I have, particularly also maybe before the background of all these references to classical poets. But yeah, so thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the clarity on the title. The book was also written into the 2000s, so it was really written in the 90s and 2000s. So I'd be really curious to look through, which isn't to say it's not reflecting on the past, because it certainly is. There's a lot in there that's like, oh, I still remember when I made the Goethe project and I was thinking about these questions. I'm going to have to dive into that text again and see what I make of that use of Flucht. The humorous aspects of the work, I mean, for sure, there's this exaggeration that especially you can see in The Death of Kasper Hauser, right? At the end, when this man who has this like gorgeous David Bowie makeup and is wearing, like no bottoms, basically, or a thong, I should say, and this like leather top. He like scarfs down raw meat. And and there's this really like loud sound, like as if an animal like devouring its prey. And I've always found that to be very, very funny and like intentionally kind of gross. And so, but at the same time, like there's this great attention to how the whole project is constructed, right? Like, so there's a sincerity that also that sometimes allows itself to laugh at itself a little bit, I suppose, right? There's one of the things that people have always described these works to me, or what it was like to work with him on set, which is, kind of a misnomer in the spontaneity of experimental film in general, was that he really wanted people to kind of follow his directions, right? So the devouring of the flesh was a sincere, funny closing to that film. And other films where there's humor, I'm trying to think. Not really in the sense, I mean, I know what you're getting at, and I'm going to have to look through these a little bit more, but I see playfulness. I see, a lot of joy and desire to like move with other bodies, to handle bodies, right? To sort of show people together, but not necessarily ironically, like really a little bit different, but I'd have to look into it. And that also then leads me to your last question about the television tower and human tower. I've always thought of that as more a kind of like, look at how much these bodies are capable of doing. However, of course, that the text that is selected in 2006 to accompany, which talks about the damaging inclusion of technology, could potentially be a reflection of that moment, right? Of this early 2000s Berlin scene changing so quickly, right? So what leads me to want to do is to go back to the archive and look at previous iterations of that film and the treatment. So in the archive, there are little tapes that sometimes have different sound than what is included on these DVDs, or that Matthias provided for us. So I'd have to kind of look and see, did he make that change in 2006, or did it exist? Because I definitely see where you're going with that.
Thank you so much, Sarah. We have two more questions. One is by Anna Horakova. Please go ahead.
I think maybe Matteo Bertales raised his hand first.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
It's fine, Hannah. Hi, by the way.
All right, thank you. And thank you so much, Sarah, for another wonderful talk. I basically just have a question for, well, two questions, I'd say. The first one would be what you, maybe just seeing what your thoughts are on Hahnemann's sort of this queer underground cinema in comparison to more, let's say, mainstream, but nevertheless somewhat experimental GDR queer cinema. I'm mainly thinking of Heine Karu's data feature from '89 coming out. So I was particularly struck by this quote that you showed, where Hahnemann says that the gay aspect of my work is simply a theme, and then basically just maybe if you could elaborate on how this kind of filmic production relates to the kind of more mainstream film production. And then another question would be on Hahnemann's relationship to literature. So I actually, before your talk, your book, I've come across him as an author, writing Ariadne Fabrik, doing kind of creative writing. So I was wondering if you could maybe say a little bit more about this relationship between his cinema and his sort of creative literary sort of art.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. In his archive, which seriously seems to include every newspaper clipping of interest to him, included a lot on coming out, right? A real excitement about that film. And of course, I don't know if Kyle Frackman's still here, but the story of that film, right? It was released on November 9th, right? By happenstance. So he also talks about, in the archive, he has these sort of notes on the kind of lack of attention that movie gave and received, and things like this. And at the exact same time, of course, that movie is coming out, he was working on the set design for Männerbiografien, and he also includes costume design. I'm not entirely sure if those were his designs. I'd have to look back at my notes in the archive, but I remember really specifically seeing these drawings of each of the people who are going to basically speak monologues that Lemke organized around homosexuality and then created into this play around the same time as coming out. And his belief that Männerbiografien was serving a different kind of function, right? It was not a narrative, right? It's a set of anecdotes, and so he definitely knew about it coming out, and of course it's pretty telling that by 91 he's not really making films anymore because things are different, especially for the gay circles he's running in. The kind of fight is different, and Lemke writes about this as well, right? That there's kind of a real solidarity that happens in East Germany that is kind of lost and disbanded when Germany reunifies. And then your other question about literature, yeah, absolutely. I mean, what I see, right? So this book, Exogene Erinnerung, came out in 94, and there are other books that he wrote that come out in the 1990s. This is, as you can tell, Gerhard Wolf, right, press. So obviously he's still like part of that East German lit scene. And I mean, to my mind, they were equally significant, right? And there's a real grappling with literature through a lot of these films. So what does it mean to be fascinated by somebody like Goethe, who he also knows, he says at some points he thinks destroyed German culture, which is, a controversy that I don't have enough understanding of to really weigh in on. However, it's something he says, and he still makes this 20-minute Goethe project in which Goethe kills everybody who's like a potential cultural rival. And he writes a lot about ego and desire and wanting to make a mark, and then the trappings of fame and power, things like that. So I think that there's a lot of relationship between the literature and the film production, and really fascinating and important that he moves just to writing after 1991. So thanks for that question. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. The last question is Mateusz. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Sara. Thank you very much for your brilliant, very interesting presentation. And I have actually many questions, but I will just focus on two, perhaps. I also wanted to thank Matthias because he mentioned Pasolini. To me also, it was a quite clear reference from the very beginning. Yeah, when I also this kind of gaze, a very neorealistic, naive, but also documentary gaze. So I was wondering whether also Pasolini was a director, a gay director that he knew. I don't even know whether Pasolini was distributed, or circulating in the circles that where Gino Hahnemann was in. And the second one is just, I was wondering about a leading image that you selected, the poster, which is also the one on the cover of your book. If you could tell us something more about it.
Sure. Matthias, you could have to clarify if Pasolini was available in East Germany, but my guess is yes.
Yes, of course. There was even lots of film to see because Pasolini was a communist. That's why he was a very big friend in East Germany, and we saw all the movies in nice cinemas, and this was a big influence. But actually, it's a little bit, it's very nice to say for me because my English is not so good, but I try just to say the most important thing is there was a change after the change. And this is maybe die Schleich Boy, you know, the 5 books. This is about to reflect the time and what is the difference. And it's not about good or bad, it's just about the few, how civilization act each other. And there was a big difference before and after. And for Gino was very important because his life was free. He was totally free. In East Germany, he was even more free than after because the system makes anything about, let's say, simple money. And in East Germany, money was never a fact. Nothing was around money. That means all the art was totally free and no one was afraid to spell something out, to say something. Just, they didn't have to be political, but any art is political. Finally, you know, there was a consensus that the people have to stay together, and that's why they help each other. And that's why they also, this is the wrong word, but they entertained each other. So all the events in East Germany was just gathering all the people together and being strong and being very, how I can say, being very connected. And this was a thing what Gino lose after the change. So after living in a new system, it's new for everyone, and the reflection was the most important part for Gino after this. That's why, Sara, so nice, this all movie stuff, it's from the time before. And that's why I think it's important to accelerate and to see maybe the difference. That's good, why not? Thank you. Thank you for all of this.
Yeah, thank you so much for that clarification too. So your other question is about the book cover. So I guess it's kind of obscured in that little circle thing, but here it is, you know, front and back. This is an image from a Stasi observation, very long documentation of an event called Intermedia 1, which Hahnemann was at actually, and it was his, I don't know if Elska's still here, but it was his films that drew Gabi Stutzer to start making films. So there was this major event that was involving, you know, dozens of artists and many musicians, filmmakers, fashion show, huge event right outside Dresden, 2 nights long, just like uproarious party taking place at an official cultural center. And I'm going to try and keep this really brief, right? But essentially this event was, even though it was aggressively surveilled, right? And this is why I chose this image for my cover, even though it was aggressively surveilled, you can see, and in fact, the Intermedia 1 was meant to create Intermedia 2, which never happened because people were fired and lots of people used it as a reason to leave East Germany forever because they were fed up. And even though we know through the evidence of the Stasi record that they were very aggressively present, and even that the people who were informing were friends with those present, right? So you can see in this that there's this interesting exchange between the man and woman and whoever's taking their photograph, right? That the man is even playing around and saying like, hey, let me photograph you while you photograph me. And the woman's kind of smiling, right? So you can see that there is a friendly association between this person who's working for the Stasi and the people they're observing. And the thing about Intermedia 1 was it was meant to be a kind of shutdown of any of these possibilities. Again, really the last time that East German government would be really assertive and aggressive in its shutting down of experimental art events. And what it actually did was it catalyzed people to be more organized, to be more careful in how they organized, better at getting bureaucratic promises made, things in writing, better at using official spaces, better at collaborating with each other. And it actually ended up begetting all the fascinating, very public-facing experimental art events that would take place in the final years of the GDR. So that's, as I said, the briefest I could do on that cover, but I'm glad you pointed out.
Thank you.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think that's a good way to end. Sara, thank you very much for this wonderful talk. Thank you everyone for being here, for your great questions and comments. And yeah, I'm very happy with the event. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Anna. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Matthias. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.